Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into the world of David Hume today.
Oh, a fascinating choice.
He's one of those figures in 18th century thought who, you might not know by name,
Right.
but his ideas are kind of in the air we breathe, so to speak.
Mm.
So we're going to be looking at some of his major works. We're going to be looking at the treatise, a treatise of human nature,
Huge.
dialogues concerning natural religion, and even dip into his history of England.
Yeah.
And so to get us started, one of the things that's so interesting about Hume is how ambitious he was as a philosopher.
Yeah.
I mean, he wanted to create a science of man.
Yes. Yes. That was the goal, right? To be like a Newton of the mind.
Right, exactly.
To figure out laws that explain how our minds work.
Yeah, so how do we understand human beings and how they operate with the same kind of rigor that we understand the natural world?
Right. Right.
So where does he even begin with such a, massive undertaking?
Well, he starts with kind of a simple observation. It seems really simple at first. It's that, everything that's in our minds, every thought we have, every idea, every concept,
Yeah.
ultimately comes from experience.
Okay.
And he uses this word impressions to talk about the basic building blocks of our experience.
Okay, so help me understand. What does he mean by impressions?
So think about if you're biting into a juicy, ripe apple.
Yeah.
You've got the taste, you've got the smell, you've got the feeling of it in your hand, the redness, the visual experience of it.
Okay.
All of those vivid, immediate sensations, those are what he calls impressions.
Okay.
So those are the kind of raw data. And then later on, you might remember that apple, you might think about it,
Right.
you might have an idea of an apple. But that idea is like a fainter copy of the original vivid impression.
Okay. So the impressions are the real deal, the kind of the strong, vivid experience.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the ideas are reflections on those.
The after images.
The after images, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
That makes sense.
So even our most abstract ideas like justice or freedom, he thinks ultimately they have to be traced back to these basic impressions.
Right.
They're kind of built up from those simple experiences.
So that's his starting point. And he takes that starting point and kind of makes some pretty radical conclusions.
Yeah.
And one of the most famous ones is this idea of cause and effect.
Yes. This is where things get really interesting.
Right. And I've always found this so fascinating, but it also kind of blows my mind a little bit because he's basically saying we don't actually observe cause and effect.
That's right.
We just see one thing happen after another.
So we might think we see it.
Right.
So what Hume says is all we're really experiencing is a sequence of events.
Okay.
So his classic example is billiard balls.
Right.
You see one ball hit another ball and then the second ball moves.
Yeah.
And we naturally think, well, obviously the first ball caused the second ball to move.
Yeah.
But what Hume says is, hold on a second. All you actually saw was the first ball moving, then contact, and then the second ball moving.
Right.
You didn't actually see the causal force itself, the thing that connects those two events.
Yeah.
That's just something our minds add.
Okay.
It's an inference.
Okay, so that's what's so trippy about Hume is he's like, look, you think you're seeing the cause,
Yeah.
but you're actually making an assumption.
Yeah, we're filling in the gap.
You're filling in the gap. Okay, I get it.
Based on our past experiences, yeah.
So, I mean, if we can't actually observe cause and effect, if it's just, this kind of mental habit that we have,
Yeah.
I mean, does that mean that we can't be certain about anything at all? Does it throw all of our knowledge into question?
Yeah, and that's where this radical skepticism comes in.
Right.
Because, he's not saying that we should just throw up our hands and say, well, I can't know anything.
Right.
But what he is saying is we need to be really careful about the claims that we're making.
Huh?
And that a lot of the things that we take for granted as knowledge might actually be based on assumptions and habits rather than really solid evidence.
Okay, so it's more like a word of caution.
Yeah.
Hey, be careful about what you think you know.
Exactly. Yeah.
And where do we go from there? How do we operate in the world if we can't be certain?
Well, and he thinks, look, we have experience.
Okay.
That's a really powerful tool.
Right.
We can observe the world.
Right.
We can see patterns.
Yeah.
And we can use those to make reasonable judgments.
Okay.
But we always have to remember that our knowledge is limited.
Right.
And we should be open to revising our beliefs when we get new evidence.
Okay.
So it's not about inaction. It's just about being careful and thoughtful.
Wow, this is already making me rethink everything. It's he's really pulling the rug out from under our basic assumptions about how the world works.
Hmm.
And it's not just cause and effect, right? He applies this kind of radical thinking to all sorts of things,
Mm.
like morality.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
That's a
man.
big one.
He says morality is based on feelings and sentiments, not some abstract rule. I mean,
Mm.
that's a pretty wild claim.
It is.
When we think about morality, we usually think about right and wrong.
Right, right.
Like, what's the rule? What's the principle?
Exactly.
But so, like, how can he say it's all about feeling?
Well, so he's looking at, what makes us call something good or bad.
Yeah.
And what he's saying is that ultimately it comes down to our emotional responses.
Okay.
So, if we see an action and it makes us feel approval, we call it good.
Okay.
And if it makes us feel disapproval, we call it bad.
So it's the feeling that comes first.
Yeah, it's like this gut reaction almost.
And then the judgment comes after.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. That's so different from how, most people think about ethics.
Right. We think about figuring it out rationally, like
Yeah.
what's the logical thing to do? But Hume is saying, no, it's actually these gut feelings that are driving a lot of it.
Okay, so our emotions are really at the heart of our moral sense, according to Hume.
Yeah, yeah. He thinks that empathy and compassion, these are kind of the root of morality.
Wow. This is heavy stuff.
It is. He was really shaking things up.
Yeah, yeah. You could see why he was controversial. He's really challenging like our deepest held beliefs about ourselves and the world.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's just so thought-provoking. It's making me question everything I thought I knew.
That's what's so great about him. And we're just scratching the surface here. I mean, he's got so much to say about religion,
Right.
about politics,
Yeah.
history, and it all kind of flows from this core idea of, grounding our understanding in human experience and being willing to question everything.
Yeah.
Even the things that seem most certain.
Man, I'm already like a little overwhelmed.
It's a lot, yeah.
Where do we even go from here?
Well, I think the best way to really appreciate Hume is to look at his arguments in more detail. So why don't we dive into his dialogues concerning natural religion
Okay.
and see how he tackles this question of God. Always
yeah.
a fun one.
It's a big one. Let's see what kind of trouble he stirs up.
He's always stirring up trouble. That's what he does.
That's why we love him.
That's right. Okay, so where were we? Oh yeah, Hume and religion. Buckle up. This is where things get really interesting.
Yeah, this is the part that I think a lot of people find the most challenging about Hume, but also the most thought-provoking.
Right. He really goes for the jugular in dialogues concerning natural religion. I mean, he tackles the big questions head on.
Yeah, and he does it in a way that's both skeptical and, I think, kind of playful. Like he's enjoying poking at these cherished beliefs.
Oh, totally. There's a real sense of intellectual curiosity there. It's not just about tearing down beliefs. It's about trying to understand how we come to believe what we believe.
Right, and one of the arguments he really digs into is this classic argument from design, right? The idea that the world is so complex and well-ordered, it must have been designed by some intelligent being.
Exactly. It's like finding a watch in the middle of a field. You wouldn't just assume it appeared there randomly. You'd think there must be a watchmaker.
Right, and that's the analogy that people often use for the universe, right? It's so intricate, it seems like it must have been designed.
Yeah, but Hume, through his character Philo in the dialogues, he's like, hold on a second. Even if we grant that the universe looks designed, does that really tell us anything about the designer?
Yeah, it's like, just because something looks designed doesn't mean we automatically know who or what designed it, or even if it was designed intentionally.
Right. And he points out, we have experience with watches and watchmakers, but we don't have any experience with universes and universe makers. So how can we really compare the two?
Okay, that makes sense. It's like we're projecting our own human categories and experiences onto something that's vastly different from anything we know.
Exactly. And that's a dangerous move, according to Hume. We have to be really careful about drawing these grand conclusions about the nature of God based on our very limited understanding of the universe.
So he's not necessarily saying the universe wasn't designed, but he's questioning whether we can really know that for sure, right?
Yeah, he's pushing us to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge. We can speculate, we can wonder, but ultimately we don't have access to that kind of ultimate truth.
And it's not just the design argument. He tackles other arguments for God's existence too, right? Like the cosmological argument, the idea that everything must have a cause and therefore there must be a first cause, which is God.
Oh yeah, he goes there too. And his response is classic Hume. He's like, okay, but why does the chain of causation have to have a beginning? Why can't the universe just be infinite?
Right. He's really good at turning those arguments on their head. Like, why do we make these assumptions in the first place?
Exactly. He's forcing us to think about the underlying assumptions that shape our beliefs. And a lot of those assumptions, he argues, are not based on pure reason, but on things like custom, habit, and emotion.
It's that skepticism again, right?
Yeah.
He's always pushing us to be more aware of how our minds work, how we form beliefs, and how those beliefs might not always be grounded in pure logic.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to emphasize that Hume wasn't anti-religion. He just thought we should be more critical and thoughtful about our religious beliefs.
Yeah, and that ties back to his whole idea that morality is based on sentiment. He's basically saying both our moral and religious beliefs are profoundly shaped by our feelings and experiences.
It's all connected. Hume saw a strong link between our emotional responses and our beliefs, whether those beliefs are about right and wrong or the existence of God.
So is he saying that religious beliefs is irrational or just a product of wishful thinking?
He wouldn't put it that way. He acknowledged that religious experiences can be very powerful and meaningful for people. But he questioned whether those experiences actually provide evidence for the existence of God.
It seems like he's advocating for a more humble approach to these big questions, recognizing that human understanding has its limits.
Exactly. He's saying we need to be aware of the role that emotion, custom, even imagination play in shaping our beliefs. And we should approach these questions with a sense of intellectual humility.
This is all incredibly fascinating, but I have to ask, how does history fit into all of this? I mean, we've been talking about philosophy, religion, morality. Where does his work as a historian come in?
Oh, that's a great question. It's all connected, of course. Hume wasn't just a philosopher. He was a renowned historian, best known for his massive history of England.
Okay, so how did his philosophical ideas shape his approach to history?
Well, for Hume, history wasn't just about recounting facts and dates. It was about understanding human nature and the forces that shape societies.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. So he's basically taking that same skepticism, that same focus on human nature, and applying it to the study of the past.
Exactly. He believed that by studying history, we could gain insights into the present and maybe even make some educated guesses about the future.
It's like he's saying, if we want to understand ourselves and the world we live in, we need to understand where we came from and how we got here.
Right, and he was particularly interested in the role of passions, ideas, and customs in driving historical change. He saw them as the real movers and shakers of history.
That makes total sense. I mean, we've been talking about how he saw passions as central to our moral judgments and even religious beliefs. So it's natural that he would see them as shaping the course of history as well.
Yeah, he was consistent in his thinking. He saw human nature as the key to understanding pretty much everything.
So he wasn't just a chronicler of events. He was trying to make sense of the past through this lens of human nature and the power of passions.
Exactly, and that led him to some really interesting insights. He wasn't afraid to challenge conventional historical narratives or question the motives of the people in power.
It sounds like reading his History of England would be quite an
That
adventure.
it definitely is. He brings history to life in a way that few historians can. And he always keeps you thinking, questioning, reevaluating.
That's what's so great about Hume. He doesn't give you easy answers. He gives you a whole new way of looking at the world.
And that's a perfect segue to exploring another dimension of Hume's thought, his political philosophy.
Oh yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. But before we dive into that, can we take a quick step back and revisit one of Hume's most radical ideas, the one we started with, his skepticism about cause and effect? I'm still grappling with that one.
Of course, it's such a foundational concept, and it really underpins everything else we've been talking about. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I think for me, it's still hard to wrap my head around the fact that we don't actually see cause and effect, you know?
Right.
We just see one thing happening and then another thing happening.
Yeah, it's such a fundamental part of how we think about the world.
Yeah.
But Hume is saying, look, that connection that you're making, that's something that your mind is adding. It's
Okay.
not something that's directly observable.
So how does he explain that, that tendency we have to see cause and effect everywhere if we're not actually seeing it?
Well, he says it's all about custom and habit.
Oh.
You know, we see things happen over and over again.
Yeah.
Like the sun rises every morning,
Right.
or I push a ball and it rolls.
Yeah.
And so our minds start to connect those events.
We expect one to follow the other.
Exactly. We form these associations based on repeated experience.
Okay.
He calls it constant conjunction.
Constant conjunction.
Yeah, so we see event A constantly conjoined with event B, and we come to believe that A causes B.
Okay, so it's like our brain is kind of creating a shortcut.
Exactly.
It's just like jumping from one thing to the next
Yeah.
based on what it's seen before.
Yeah, and it makes sense, right? I mean, we need these shortcuts to navigate the world.
Right.
Otherwise, we'd be constantly starting from scratch, trying to figure everything out.
Yeah, we wouldn't get anything done.
But Hume's point is that, this belief in causation, it's based on probability and inductive reasoning.
Okay.
It's not based on, like, some direct perception of a causal force.
So again, it's this like reminder of the limits of our knowledge.
Right. Yeah.
Just because we see something happening repeatedly doesn't mean we fully understand the underlying mechanisms.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that it will always happen that way.
Right.
There might be exceptions. There might be other factors involved that we're not aware of.
So, I mean, if we can't be certain about causation, does that mean we just throw our hands up and say, well, we can't know anything?
No, not at all. Hume wasn't advocating for paralysis or inaction. He was just urging us to be more intellectual humble,
Okay.
to recognize that even our most basic beliefs are often based on probability and inference, not on absolute certainty.
So it's like, be aware of the shortcuts your mind is taking and don't mistake them for absolute truth.
That's a great way to put it. And this cautious approach to knowledge has implications for everything, from scientific inquiry to our everyday decision-making.
So how should we make decisions then if we can't be absolutely certain about anything?
Well, Hume believed in the power of reason and observation to guide our actions.
Okay.
But he also emphasized the importance of acknowledging those limits of human knowledge.
Right.
We should base our judgments on the best available evidence,
Yeah.
but we should also be open to revising those judgments as we learn more.
So it's not about throwing reason out the window.
No.
It's about using reason in a way that's like tempered with a healthy dose of skepticism. Wow. This has been an incredible journey through Hume's mind. We've covered so much ground, his ideas about how our minds work, his views on morality, religion, history.
Yeah, he was a real intellectual powerhouse.
What a legacy, right? I mean, to have this kind of lasting impact on how we think about these fundamental questions.
Yeah, I mean, his ideas are still relevant today.
Yeah, he was ahead of his time in a lot of ways.
Definitely. And I think one of the most important takeaways from our deep dive is that, he's reminding us to always be questioning, to dig deeper, to not take things at face value.
To be critical thinkers.
Exactly.
And not to be afraid to challenge our own beliefs.
Right. Yeah. To be open to new evidence, to be open to changing our minds.
And for me, what's so inspiring is that even with all his skepticism,
Yeah.
he never lost his sense of wonder. He was genuinely curious about the world and how it works.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we can all learn from, to approach these big questions with a sense of like intellectual curiosity. And even if we don't find all the answers, that the journey itself is valuable.
Absolutely. That's the beauty of philosophy, isn't it? It's not about finding the right answers. It's about asking the right questions.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. Thank you all for joining us on this exploration of David Hume's thought.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of ideas.
Until then, keep those minds curious.